On the 14th of March 1876, a county surveyor in a river town in the American Midwest filed a routine report about a single house on the edge of a bluff. The house had been sealed, not abandoned, sealed, doors and windows bricked over from the outside, the chimney capped, the cellar door mortared shut. The surveyor's report says the seal was professional work, done by masons, not by neighbours boarding up a ruin. By 1890, that same street held 11 more sealed houses. By the turn of the century, the sealing had spread to the entire block. Nobody in the official record ever explains why. I want to be precise about what I am claiming and what I am not. I am not claiming a ghost story. I am not claiming a plague that the town covered up out of shame. I am claiming that a documented pattern of deliberate architectural sealing spread across an American town over a period of roughly 25 years, that the pattern was tracked in real time by a county surveyor whose reports still exist, and that every institution with the authority to explain that pattern instead worked to erase the record of it. That is not a ghost story. That is a paper trail, and I have spent the better part of 3 years walking it. My name doesn't matter here. What matters is that I spent 30 years as an archivist for a regional historical society before I retired, cataloguing collections nobody had opened in a generation. That is how I found the first ledger. Not researching this story, cataloguing an unrelated estate collection, the papers of a deceased mining engineer, boxes his family wanted appraised and sold. Buried in the third box was a leather-bound survey ledger that had nothing to do with mining. It was a property record, and it did not match any property record in the town's current archive. The town does exist. I am not naming it because the family that controls the land now still owns most of what matters there, and I have learned the hard way what happens to people who name names before they can prove them. Call it River Bend. It sits where two waterways meet, on a bluff that made it a natural crossing point for trade going back centuries before the town was formally platted in 1851. The first sealed house belonged, according to town tax rolls, to a widow named Verity Ashcombe. The rolls say she died in 1875. They do not say what she died of. They do not say who sealed her house or who paid for the masonry, or why a house belonging to a dead widow with no heirs on record required that level of structural intervention rather than simple demolition or resale. The survey ledger I found says something different. It says the house was inspected by a county surveyor named Holt Pemberton in February of 1876, 1 month before the official sealing report. Pemberton's private notes, because that ledger was his personal working copy, not the version filed with the county, describe a subfloor chamber beneath the widow's cellar, fieldstone construction, not built by the widow, not built by anyone in her documented family line. Pemberton measured it, 9 feet by 12 feet, corbelled ceiling, a masonry technique he explicitly notes he had never seen used in any structure built by the town's founding families. That is where the official account stops. There is no follow-up report. There is no second inspection. There is only the sealing order, filed 1 month later, citing structural hazard as the reason, a phrase that appears nowhere in Pemberton's own notes. I have to explain something about how 19th century property law worked in river towns like this one, because it matters enormously to what happened next. This was the era of the railroad survey. Rail companies expanding through Midwest river basins in the 1870s and 80s needed clear title and clear ground, and they had enormous influence over how local land was classified, assessed, and, when necessary, cleared. A structural hazard designation was not a neutral finding. It was a legal instrument. It gave a landholder, or a company acting through a landholder, the authority to seal, condemn, or demolish a structure without further public inquiry. Once that designation was on the books, the story was over, officially. But Pemberton kept surveying. That's the part the official record was never supposed to preserve. Between 1876 and 1884, Pemberton documented 7 more properties on the same street, each showing the same subfloor chamber pattern: fieldstone, corbelled ceiling, a construction technique with no attributed origin. Each structure was subsequently sealed under the same structural hazard designation. Each seal was carried out by the same masonry contractor, a man named Ezra Coyle, whose invoices Pemberton also copied into his personal ledger, apparently because he found the volume of the man's business suspicious for a town of Riverbend's size. I found Coyle's business records in a separate archive, in a different county, 40 miles away, deliberately I believe, though I cannot yet prove who moved them there. Between 1876 and 1900, Ezra Coyle sealed 29 structures in Riverbend. 29. An entire town block by the year 1900, exactly as the sealing pattern eventually confirms. Here is the first thing that should not make sense to you. A town of Riverbend's size, in this period, had one masonry contractor capable of this specialised work, doing nothing but sealing chambers for 24 years, and not one newspaper account, not one town council minute, not one church record mentions why. In a town small enough that everyone would have known Ezra Coyle's wagon by sight. That is not an absence of evidence. That is a gap that was made. I want to introduce you to the person who first tried to say this out loud, because her story is the reason I am telling you this one. Her name, and I use it because she is dead, and because what happened to her deserves to be spoken plainly, was Idelle Marchetti. She was the estate archivist for the family that eventually purchased and consolidated most of Riverbend's riverside properties in the 1890s. A dynasty of grain and rail money the historical record refers to only by their holding company. Marchetti was hired in 1903 to catalogue the family's private collection after the death of the family patriarch. She found Pemberton's original ledger, the filed version, not the private copy I found decades later in an unrelated estate. Marchetti's own notes, preserved because her granddaughter donated them to a small regional archive in the 1970s without fully understanding what was in them, describe her reaction plainly. She wrote that the chamber dimensions matched across all 29 structures to within inches. She wrote that the masonry technique matched a description she had encountered once before, in a different collection, describing structures along a different river system entirely, 400 miles away. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. Marchetti tried to bring her findings to the family that employed her. Her employment ended within the month. Her notes describe being told in a meeting she recorded almost verbatim that her findings were not the kind of history the family collects. She was given a severance payment on the condition that she surrender all copies of her research. She kept one copy. It survived because she hid it inside an unrelated ledger, the way I would later find Pemberton's notes hidden inside an unrelated ledger of my own. I do not think that is a coincidence either. I think it reflects a survival strategy that people in her position learned to use again and again across decades, because it was the only way anything survived at all. I will come back to what happened to Marchetti after her dismissal, but first I need to widen the frame, because Riverbend is not unique. It only felt unique to me for the first 8 months of this investigation, because I hadn't yet found the second town. The second town sits on a different river system in a different Midwest state, 400 miles from River Bend, the same distance Marchetti noted in her own research decades before I found it independently. A county historical survey conducted in 1931, digitized only in the last decade and largely unindexed, documents a nearly identical pattern. A single, sealed structure in 1879, expanding to a full block of sealed structures by 1898. The masonry contractor's invoices in that county's records describe the same fieldstone and corbel technique. The same structural hazard designation appears on every filing. Two towns, same technique, same timeline, staggered by 3 years. Same legal instrument used to seal the evidence, structure by structure, until an entire town block had been quietly closed to inspection. I want you to sit with the timeline for a moment, because the timeline is the argument. 1876 to 1900 is not a random span. It is the exact window of the greatest railroad expansion through Midwest river corridors in American history. A period during which rail and grain interests acquired staggering authority over local land classification, and during which a structural hazard designation could clear a property of legal challenge in a matter of weeks. If you wanted to seal something at scale, quietly, using instruments no one would question, this is precisely the window in which you could do it. Here is the second thing that should not make sense to you. Fieldstone corbelled chambers of this precise dimension and construction method are documented in the archaeological literature, sparingly, and always attributed to isolated, unconnected causes, in at least 6 other river-adjacent locations across the Midwest and Ohio River Valley, dating to the same general era of construction, beneath structures built decades or centuries later. No 2 of these locations, as far as the published record shows, have ever been connected to one another. I have now personally traced connections between 3 of them, through property transfer records, through masonry contractor invoices, through the surviving fragments of surveyors' private papers, that somebody, somewhere, always seemed compelled to hide rather than destroy. Why hide rather than destroy? I have asked myself that question more than any other in this investigation, and I think the answer tells you something important about the people doing the hiding. Destruction is total. Hiding preserves the option of retrieval. Someone, across 3 counties, across 2 states, across nearly a quarter century, chose to preserve the possibility that this evidence could one day be found again, rather than eliminate it outright. That is not the behaviour of people ashamed of what they buried. That is the behaviour of people who believed, correctly, that they would never be caught, and who valued the record enough to keep it rather than burn it. Now I will tell you what happened to Adele Marchetti, because her fate is the clearest evidence I have that this suppression was coordinated rather than incidental. After her dismissal in 1903, Marchetti attempted to publish her findings independently, submitting a manuscript to 2 regional historical journals. Both rejected it. The rejection letters, which survive in her personal papers, cite nearly identical language, insufficiently substantiated, and outside the scope of documented regional history, submitted by editorial boards that, according to the membership rosters I have located, shared no overlapping members. 2 independent institutions in different states rejecting the same manuscript using nearly identical phrasing within 4 months of each other. Every researcher who has followed this line of inquiry has arrived at the same wall. Marchetti died in 1931 in relative obscurity, working as a school teacher in a town unconnected to either River Bend or the family that had employed and then discarded her. Her granddaughter's donation of her papers in the 1970s went unindexed for 4 decades. I am, as far as I can determine, the first person to read her complete research since the archivists who processed that donation, who apparently did not understand what they were looking at. Every researcher who has followed this line of inquiry has arrived at the same wall. I said that once already. I am saying it again because it is the single most consistent fact in this entire investigation. Not the sealed structures, not the matching dimensions, the wall. The same wall encountered independently by researchers working decades apart in different states with no knowledge of one another's work. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and a pattern this consistent does not emerge by accident. It requires coordination. It requires an interest, financial, institutional, or both, large enough to maintain the same posture of denial across a century, through multiple generations of the family whose land holdings sit at the centre of nearly every documented case. So let me offer you the alternative framework, the one the evidence points toward, even though I cannot yet prove every piece of it. What if the fieldstone corbelled chambers beneath Riverbend and beneath at least 5 other Midwest river towns are not isolated curiosities, but fragments of a single infrastructure, older than any of the towns built above it, older than the documented arrival of the populations credited with settling this region? What if the railroad and grain interests who acquired this land in the 1870s did not merely benefit from what they found beneath it, but understood immediately that public knowledge of a prior unexplained infrastructure running beneath their newly acquired river corridors would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny that could unravel the legal fictions their land claims depended on? A property claim is only as strong as the story told about the land. If the land had already been built upon by someone long before any documented claim to it existed, what happens to 1876 river frontage title? I am not going to tell you I have proven a lost civilization beneath the American Midwest. I do not have that evidence yet, and I distrust anyone who claims certainty they have not earned. What I have is this: a documented 29 structure ceiling pattern in one town, replicated in at least one more town 400 miles away, connected to at least 3 additional sites through contractor and property records, spanning a 24-year window that corresponds exactly to the period of maximum vulnerability for large-scale land acquisition along Midwest river corridors, and the 150-year pattern of institutional rejection so consistent that 2 independent researchers working 60 years apart hit the identical wall using nearly identical language. I have spent 3 years trying to determine how many sites like this actually exist. I want to give you the honest arithmetic, because I think the number matters more than any single sealed house ever could. If the pattern holds across even a conservative fraction of the documented river corridors that saw comparable rail and grain acquisition between 1870 and 1900, and I have cross-referenced surveyor employment records against acquisition timelines for 11 such corridors so far, the number of potentially sealed structures is not in the dozens. Based on the density I have confirmed at Riverbend and its sister site, extrapolated conservatively across even a third of the comparable corridors, the number approaches 400 structures. 400 sealed chambers. 400 instances of the same legal instrument, the same masonry technique, the same silence. 400 is not a folk legend. 400 is an infrastructure. I do not know who gave the original order. I do not know whether it was a single coordinating figure or a set of parallel decisions made independently by people who all recognize the same threat to the same kind of land claim. I know that the record was built to make sure I would never find out easily, and I know that the record survived anyway, in ledgers and estate boxes and unindexed donations, because the people who kept it, Pemberton, Marchetti, and others whose names I have not yet recovered, believed it mattered enough to save, even when saving it cost them everything. The algorithm tends to bury this kind of investigation the same way Riverbend buried Adele Marchetti's research. If you want to follow where the evidence leads from here, subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. I will come back to the other 7 corridors in a future investigation, because I believe the number 400 is still an undercount. But I want to leave you with this. The seal on Verity Ashcombe's cellar door in 1876 was not the beginning of a story about one house. It was the first visible mark of an infrastructure that may run beneath more of this country's river towns than any of us have been taught to imagine. An infrastructure someone found in 1876, measured, and chose to hide rather than explain. The ledgers remember. The invoices remember. The question is whether we are willing to keep counting. Share this with one person who asks the right questions. That is how this kind of knowledge survives long enough to be counted. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, count the chambers.